This was pre-planned, premeditated, 5 months in advance, and it was initially timed to take place on the Gurpurab of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, which falls in the first week of November. But obviously that planned genocide was brought forward.
Alright, what's going on everyone? Welcome back to another Ramblings of a Sikh podcast. Today's topic of discussion is the November 1984 anti-Sikh genocide. This topic is not only dear to Sikhs around the world, but is also perhaps one of the most misunderstood periods of human history amongst the general public. This ignorance is fully due to top to bottom government cover-up, the intimidating and unconquerable state ensuring the reality of the events took decades to reach the wider public, and justice, well, there has been almost none. Today I get to sit with Pav Singh,
Thank you for having me.
author of 1984 India's Guilty Secret, and discuss a whole range of questions including how his own family was impacted by the events of 1984. If Indira Gandhi had not been assassinated, had the events of November 1st to November 3rd taken place? How and why did things come to an end on November 3rd? Naming those who are responsible, starting with those right at the top. And not to forget, we also question and look at the extent to which the British government helped the Indian government during 1984. We obviously discuss a whole range of other questions, and there's a lot that you will hopefully learn from this, so please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and watch this right to the end. Now let's get straight into it. So if you don't mind, could you possibly tell us a little bit about your family's upbringing and history and where you kind of fit into all of that?
Sure. So I was actually born in Yorkshire, in Leeds, but my parents are from the Punjab, of Sikh background. So my dad actually came over in 1962, actually from Singapore. So he was in Singapore for the duration of the war, and then after the war, he got married and then brought his wife, my mother, over, and my older brother as well, who was born in Singapore. So they all three came over, and then settled in Leeds of all places. So my dad actually, although he was a bit of a businessman in Singapore, over here he did quite hard work in terms of building sites, and he did work in scaffolding. And my mum was a seamstress, so working in the textile industry in Leeds. So yeah, I was born in 1966, but coming in 84, I think I was 17 years old. So the actual day of Mrs. Gandhi's assassination and what took place afterwards is still vivid in my memory, especially particularly the morning of the 31st. So I'm very familiar with the events. I also have my maternal aunt who was based in Delhi at the time. My aunt Masi and my Masad and 4 cousins, they were all based in Delhi. So managed to get first-hand accounts from them following 1984 with my frequent visits to India. So yeah, that's pretty much my background. I went to university down in London, and I basically stayed down south. But it was really during my university days that became quite political, in terms of what was going on here. We still had the apartheid system in South Africa, so I was very keenly campaigning against apartheid during the late 80s, marching against the racist government in South Africa, calling for the release of Nelson Mandela. And I am also quite active in the Anti-Nazi League at the time as well. So we had a growth of the BNP at the time, and before that the National Front. So I was quite active against the emergence of fascist organizations who were causing lots of trouble against Black and Asian communities in the late 80s and early 90s. So that was sort of my kind of political background, and I think I was always kind of on the political left at the time. So yeah, that's pretty much where I came from when I faced looking at 1984 in a different way.
Obviously, I'm from a generation that didn't firsthand lived through the events that took place in 1984, and a lot of what we've learned has been passed down through the accounts and the research of the work of obviously like your generation and the generation prior. When you were talking about living through October 31st and November 1st, it kind of sounds similar to like events such as like 9/11, which were kind of world changing. Could you just expand a little bit about actually what you remember from that day itself, in terms of like you obviously woke up and like brushed your teeth or whatever, like as in like I know a lot of people kind of say, do you remember where you were on 9/11 or when Nelson Mandela was released from prison or X, Y, or Z? Like in a similar way, I guess it would definitely be fair to say this is a comparable event.
Most definitely. And I think particularly 1984, there was a build up to the events of November. So you had the shock of June 1984. And I think that was a real shock to the Sikh psyche, not only in India, but also the world. The, invasion of the Golden Temple by Indian army troops, and the massacre that took place. So there was a big shock already that was there. And Sikhs around the world, and particularly in Britain, there was a major march in London that I still remember my mum talking about at the time. So there was a deep hurt within the Sikh community already approaching October 31st. But October 31st, I still remember I was getting ready to go to school. I was in sixth form. Yeah, the TV was on. We knew straight away what happened. We were quite shocked, actually. So there was a few hours of real shock, and then slowly, when the news started repeating that it was two Sikhs who had killed Mrs. Gandhi in revenge of what happened in June, it sort of dawned on people slowly that this wasn't good for the Sikh minority in India. Nothing was going to come good of this. But I think we were quite surprised in the next few years how that retaliation took place. How is it that for the act of just two Sikhs in killing Mrs. Gandhi, the whole Sikh community in India were blamed for that assassination? So that sort of deep hatred that sort of started developing from early on in 1984 sort of permeated in all sections of Indian society. And I think that was the big surprise for us, particularly, in relation to who was involved from the top, also who was involved at the bottom as well. So it wasn't so clear cut, but it was only years later that a fuller picture emerged of what actually happened, not only the organization, but also in terms of neighbors actually turning upon their neighbors, which was quite a shock for us.
So, just kind of two things off the back of that. And I think one thing that is often retold when it comes to this narrative is that the assassination and then the events that took place are intrinsically linked, as though if the assassination hadn't taken place, there wouldn't have been the response. Like, to what extent is that true? Because obviously, when you read your book, it's very clear that there is really serious planning that takes place. And anyone who kind of looks at the bigger picture would assume that you can't really plan something on such a scale so quickly. So, to what extent is the assassination and the response linked, and in what way does it work?
So people at the time, particularly human rights groups, documented some of the organization that took place, but it was only 30 years later that the real truth emerged in terms of pre-planning months in advance. So we do have evidence now from a person who worked as a civil servant in the government, who has said that 5 months before, lists were compiled from the gurdwaras in Delhi of Sikh homes and businesses, and they were also used school rations lists as well. And this came right from the top, from someone who was part of the Gandhi Nehru family, Arun Nehru MP, who was involved in organizing those. So we can actually now look at actually this was pre-planned, premeditated, 5 months in advance, and it was initially timed to take place on the Gurpurab of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, which falls in the first week of November. But obviously, with the assassination that took place on the 31st of October, that planned genocide was brought forward. Also, running the weeks towards 31st of October, there's lots of evidence, eyewitness accounts of people being warned that this was going to take place. People were told to take their children out because the timing of the 1st of November was set as soon as the assassination had happened, that this would take place, and the mobs would have 3 days free reign of Delhi and outskirts of Delhi in northern India, where Congress was in power. They would have 3 days to exact revenge on the Sikh community. So yeah, there's lots of merging evidence that it was definitely pre-planned. There was, even if you look at the logistics of what took place, the availability of kerosene, which isn't available to the average man on the street, the availability of the white phosphorus chemical powder, which you can't procure unless there's organization behind it, which was used to burn its victims to the bone. The use of the buses, the unauthorized train stoppages that took place throughout northern India to seek out Sikhs on railways. There's so much, and obviously the list distribution of the lists as well, the marking of Sikh houses on the 31st of October, and also when the killings had taken place, there was a big operation which involved the police to dispose of the evidence, dispose of the bodies. So there was trucks and trucks coming out of Delhi to the outskirts of Delhi. There was mass cremations that were taking place. So yeah, it's a heavily organized event that can only take place months before, in order to make sure that the count was in the thousands, not in the hundreds.
So it's pretty fair to say that had the assassination hadn't taken place, something was being planned, and the fact that this assassination took place provided not the excuse, but it just brought things forward.
Yeah. So the reason why I mentioned June 84 is really important, because what took place in June, and then from June till November, there was a heightened tension. There was, there was a feeling in Indian society generally that even though, Sikhs been dealt a heavy blow in June 84, the job hadn't been done. Sikhs needed to be taught a lesson for the turmoil that they were blamed for what was taking place in the Punjab, the killings of Hindus in Punjab permeated into outright hatred towards the whole Sikh community. I don't want to go into too much detail of what was happening in Punjab. It was very political. There were various different groups, some groups backed by the state, some groups on their own. There were innocent Hindus killed. There's lots of Sikh leaders who were condemning what was taking place. There was a real wedge being drawn between Sikhs and Hindus by political forces for their own ends by all parties. But I think that was then permeated into Indian society, who just looked at what was happening in Punjab and blamed Sikhs en masse. So that propaganda helped and laid the ground for such a killing spree to take place.
One thing that you mentioned as you recounted the events that unfolded on October 31st / November 1st and kind of what you remember, you comment about how the bigger picture didn't come to light for, obviously, as you said, almost over 30 years. Now, how does your research tie into that? So obviously you said that you had kind of a personal connection because you already had family that firsthand experienced this, and obviously were able to tell you their, well, maybe not depending on the trauma, but obviously to some extent they were able to tell you what took place. But then in terms of kind of your research and your trips to India, could you please kind of expand on like how, as your research developed, a bigger picture came together and then I guess eventually accumulated into your book?
Yeah, sure. And I think one of the other things about why I'd started on this path was also my political background when I was at university. So for me to stand up against racism in South Africa, against fascist organizations in this country, fighting for equal rights for gays and so forth, I then started to look at actually my own community and what happened in '84 and why nothing had been done about it. And then just looking at the way the official narrative around 1984, the so-called anti-Sikh riots, how it's been framed, um, really, I think, dealt a really powerful force in, writing what happened in '84. And it was written, the history of '84 at that time was written by the perpetrators who called it a riot, a spontaneous reaction to Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. So I really wanted to investigate and then redress that narrative. And that took me to India in 2005. So I've got family out there. My master took me to some of the colonies, particularly Dalak Vihar and Dalak Nagar, visiting some of the survivors and some of the horror stories that I heard. And he plainly told me that his local MP was involved. His local MP in West Delhi was Sajjan Kumar, the only MP who's been charged out of the scores of MPs and cabinet ministers, but he's the only one who's been charged. But that took 30 years. Um, but yeah, absolutely, there was plain sight from my family's, um, um, eyewitness accounts that this was organised, particularly on the 31st of October, in terms of bringing the mobs together and then executing that on the first of November. Um, so every time I went back to India, I kept hearing more stories. And then when I went to Punjab, where I lived for a year, I heard the other stories that were taking place post November '84. What was took place in Punjab with the army, and the human rights violations that took place for a whole 10 years, where the state really went after, um, on the pretext of going after the militants, went after families and innocents. And then you had the case of the cremations that took place that Just Vance in Cholera uncovered. So there's a whole history there as well that sort of tied in with what was taking place after '84 in Delhi and other places, and the injustice for 30 years, more, nearly 40 years now, of the survivors, where there has been absolutely no justice for them.
Obviously, we've already discussed the logistical manpower required to kind of successfully execute an operation like this. To what extent are like the police, the army, and other kind of official forces that would also have included Sikhs amongst other religions and communities, to what extent are they involved or not involved?
So the police was definitely involved. They were heavily involved. And so their boss was Arun Nehru MP, who was the in charge of the Home Ministry. So on the 31st of October, there was a call from his ministry for Sikh policemen to stand down and go home.
And
So
is
that was the
this,
first.
sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but just for the curiosity's sake, we're like, in terms of location, where are we talking? And equally, is this before or after the assassinations taken place?
So this is after the assassination had taken place. A call had been made through the wires, the radio wires, to Sikh police to stand down and go home. So that was the first thing that took place.
And
A lot
this
of
is
this.
in Delhi.
This is in Delhi, yeah. And then a lot of the Sikhs policemen actually were attacked on the night of 31st, and some of them went back on the 1st of November and again they were attacked as well. So being a policeman didn't make any difference. So they took out the Sikh police who could have helped protect their community. And then the police, particularly, so we got lots of evidence, particularly in the east of Delhi, in neighborhoods like Trilakpuri and Sultanpuri and Mughalpuri on the east and also on the west side of Delhi, where policemen actively took part in organizing mobs, directing mobs to Sikh homes and businesses. Actually, they did a kind of a reconnaissance. First of all, they would go into Sikh areas, go to Sikh houses and confiscate licensed firearms and garpans, and reassure Sikhs that they'd be protected by the Sikhs. Once that was done, they would then go and allow the mobs to go into those areas and start the killings. So they were, without the police, this wouldn't have happened. Absolutely. Very isolated cases where some policemen did protect Sikhs, but they were very isolated cases. There's a famous case of one police officer in Chandi Chowk in Delhi who just had to fire one revolver and the mobs just dispersed. I mean, if that's all it took to disperse those mobs. But on the whole, and we've got policemen on camera now admitting what took place. Orders given from the above to teach Sikhs a lesson, and the police were there to direct the mobs, and then also get rid of the evidence afterwards as well.
So how do things, or why do things come to a stop then towards the 3rd of November? Sometimes it's stated that it's essentially because the army is drafted in that brings things to a stop. Is that because they aren't under the same kind of line of command as the police, or like how do the dynamics of that work?
So they were under the same command. So they were under the command of the Home Minister, who was Narasimha Rao. So basically, the mobs were given 3 days to carry out the genocide. The army was kept back for those 3 days. So we know from the testimonies of army chiefs that on the first day, there were orders not only from the Home Ministry but also from the Prime Minister's office not to intervene on the first night. On the second night, they were to just march in some of the areas, but none of the areas were affected. So they were marching down in South Delhi or somewhere else. It was only on the third that they went into the affected areas. But by that time, the genocide had already taken place. If you look at West Delhi and East Delhi, a lot of the Sikh neighborhoods had already been wiped out by that time. And many places that we now know of in Kanpur, in lots of other northern Indian places where Congress were in power, outskirts of Delhi, Haryana, Rajasthan, a lot of the places, there was no protection by the police, and the army was really late in coming into those areas. So those areas we didn't know about at the time, and that was uncovered much later. But yeah, it was principally 3 days for the mobs to carry out, and then the army would come in.
You've already kind of answered my next question, which was whether it was just specifically targeted to Delhi, but as you said, it's not, and it's taken place in numerous other areas. One question then that I wanted to obviously pick your brain about was, what role does the media play in the immediate kind of decade or two that follows this?
So in India at the time, the TV was state-owned, so Doordarshan was state-owned. All Indian Radio was state-owned. So those two media outlets played a very important part in what took place at the time. So on the 31st of November and on the 31st of October and the 1st of November, there was telecast of Mrs. Gandhi's body at Deedwundi House, continuous, round the clock. At the same time, anti-Sikh hate mobs slogans were allowed to be aired at that time. So, the infamous Khoon ka badla khoon, blood for blood, could be clearly heard. And this was, aired on national TV, the only station India had throughout India. So you could just see how, you could see the tacit support from a state agency telling people blood for blood. So that was the first thing. The second thing was the national newspapers, on the whole, didn't cover the killings at all. And even if they did, they talked about 10 people here dead, 100 people here dead, even on the third day. And the only newspaper that actually covered the massacres was the Indian Express. But even the Indian Express refused to cover the mass rapes that had taken place as well. And, I talk about that in the book, where the editor said, no, do not cover this, even though it was taking place. I think generally on the whole, the media has taken the line of the government, which is that this was a spontaneous, unorganized riot that took place, and they haven't, and even to this day, properly investigated the truth of what essentially was a genocidal massacre, where Sikhs as a minority was targeted because they were Sikhs. Their gurdwaras were attacked on the 1st of November. Their scriptures were burnt publicly. Their hair was cut. So there was a real sort of clear-cut attack on Sikhi, not just Sikhs in general, but Sikhi, to erase their religion and culture, their offspring, the women folk, to damage women and girls for generations to come in terms of sexual violence. And that story has never been told. And the numbers that they talked about as well, they never investigated that this went into the thousands. And the cremations that took place, and the postmortems, they never covered those. They never covered the fact that a lot of hospitals closed their doors to Sikh victims, burn victims. A lot of burn units were shut when actually the main injury to Sikhs were burns. Many Sikhs were attacked outside hospitals as well. There were mobs that were waiting outside. Doctors refused to, and this is all documented in my book. Even head doctors, admitted that they were told not to treat Sikhs at the time. So lots of Sikhs died as a consequence as well. The fire brigade was not sent to Sikh neighborhoods. The calls of Sikhs on the telephones were unheard, completely ignored until the third day. So you can literally see, if you look at some of the maps that I have in the book, the areas that were affected, completely wiped out. And those Sikh neighborhoods don't exist anymore, particularly in West and East Delhi. And those Sikhs who did manage to survive are now in, areas in other parts of Delhi. So those areas were, ethnically cleansed.
In your book, particularly in your chapter, I think it's called Body Count, you do a really good job of kind of compiling all of the different lists in terms of reports and estimations of those that were murdered or impacted by the carnage that unfolded over those few days. This is obviously, in some respects, kind of a rhetorical question, but do you kind of expect that we'll ever know the true extent of what actually happened during those few days? Like, your book is incredible in terms of putting together a very comprehensive picture, but it just sounds like there was so much involved in terms of the logistics, the planning, even the execution of something like this, do you think we'll ever really know the true extent of what took place?
No, I don't think so. It was so widespread, and there's many areas that weren't covered by the official but also unofficial reports, human rights reports. There's a lot of areas where outer skirts of villages in Haryana, in northern India, the violence that took place on the trains and the buses were never covered. It's only years later that we found out there were massacres that took place in those areas. Um, I, I think my main aim was to create a body of work that was evidence based. And it was really important that I was focused on evidence and witness testimony. And I didn't want to um, go outside that and make assumptions and presumptions, because I think this was a really important work that had come after being part of trying to get justice for the victims, and I felt that there was nothing really comprehensive evidence-based work that you can bring all the evidence together. I mean, there were various eyewitnesses. People have written books in India, in particular, from their point of view of their area. The official accounts didn't cover everything. Some of the human rights reports were only based in Delhi and no other areas. So I wanted to really bring together the whole picture as much as I can, covering not just the killing, but also looking at how Gurdwaras was attacked first, how the police was used, the army was kept the barracks, how rape was used during those days, and also looking at the official inquiries. So we had two major inquiries, the Misra and the Nanavati, and I really looked into detail at exactly what took place, the witness testimonies, and which were used, which were ignored. And you could see a clear line that those official inquiries still followed that official line of being a riot. And so they discounted rape, they discounted the organization, they didn't want to look at the role of Arun Nehru or the chief police officers at the time, what they were doing. They completely discounted that. They were saying, even at the Nanavati, saying that maybe there was some organization that was behind it, but actually didn't identify who that was, who they were. So there's a lot of areas that are still to this day not being properly investigated.
So one thing that I really appreciated with your book was you put together a really comprehensive list and detailed essentially the main individuals who are accused in being involved in what took place. I put together a short list and I'm sure I've missed a few people out, and again I'm sure you can provide more detail, but you've already mentioned Arun Nehru, Krishan Lal Bhagat, again he's another who's named as being pivotal and witnesses say they saw him, Gabal Nath for influencing the police. I think you've already mentioned Narasimha Rao, again a high-profile politician, and then obviously you've got people like you've mentioned, like Sajjan Kumar and Jagdish Taitlo, who are probably more known to the diaspora. Now, you mentioned Sajjan Kumar's arrest earlier. Is that a sign of justice finally happening, or is he just essentially like the sacrificial lamb, as in he's getting old? Kind of, there's been this huge pressure for something to happen or for the state to look like they're doing something, and he's the one who's kind of like been led to the slaughter, rather than there being some type of system that's actually going to work through the whole kind of backlog of cases and everything else that is kind of still lingering from 1984.
I think in terms of Sajjan Kumar, it was so obvious his involvement and his party men's involvement, whereas the other leaders had done a really good job in not just covering up, but help getting the police to intimidate witnesses and so forth. Whereas with Sajjan Kumar, we had really strong witnesses in terms of the women who couldn't be ignored. So I think that's one of the things with Sajjan Kumar. But I just really want to start from the top, really. We need to talk about Rajiv Gandhi, first of all, and his role, which in effect, although he'd lost his mother, he really looked to the other way, and he was very indifferent to the violence that was taking place, carried out by his own men. So that's the first thing. You can see that he laid the ground for this to take place. He refused to call out the army on the 31st of October. If they were called out on the 31st, this would not have happened. So that's the first thing. Secondly, he then promoted the very leaders who were involved in the massacres during the elections and promoted them, a couple of them to high office, cabinet ministers, and the others were allowed to run for the Congress party. So in fact, this was a Congress-led pogrom to start with. So you have Rajiv Gandhi, then you have his home minister, Narasimha Rao, in charge of the police and the army, Arun Nehru, and then if you go below that, then you have these local leaders, the likes of Bhagat, who was in charge of East Delhi, Sajjan Kumar, Jagdish Titler, and a whole load of local MPs, and then below that you have the local councillors who were also involved, and then you have the mobs. So you have local criminals that known to the Congress Party who were brought together on the night of the 31st, and on the 1st of November to say, right, you've got the green light, and then the lists of Sikhs were distributed on that night. Sikh households were marked to be targeted with an S, so that the next day, people know where they go. The kerosene was available. The mobs brought in on buses into Sikh neighborhoods. Gurdwara was attacked first, and then the police would go in, as I explained, confiscate weapons, and then the mobs would go in. So from a political point of view, this was a government organized from a senior Congress-led angle, but at the same time, there was also something else that was happening as well, because it's very easy just to say, oh, it's just the Congress and it's the government, and you forget about the actual mobs and the neighborhoods. So the mobs were made up predominantly of Hindus. These were Hindu mobs who were, on the one hand, organized by the Congress Party, but there were many mobs that were not, but they wanted to exact revenge on Sikhs. There was lots of other things that was happening in terms of, the motives in some areas, land grabbing in some outskirts of Delhi, and also the feeling that Sikhs needed to be cut down to size, as well. In some areas, neighbour did turn upon neighbour, but other areas, neighbours saved Sikhs. So you've got to really remember that the two things were happening at the same time. Lots of Hindus protected Sikhs, and Muslims protected Sikhs against the mobs. When the other areas, they were part of the mob. So it's not just clear-cut, political organization. It's also on the ground what was taking place.
No, definitely. It's not just black and white. With all of the podcasts, I post out normally before I'm recording to the community that obviously this podcast is coming up. This is the topic. Are there any questions that you would like me to put to the guest? And one person that kept being asked about was Gyani Zail Singh, because he's part of the Congress. Whilst he's in power, 1984 takes place, June, November. He's there throughout all of it. And it was probably the most commonly sent in question. Now, could you perhaps kind of just enlighten us about, how does he fit into everything that's taking place at this point?
Yeah, Gyani Zail Singh's story is quite interesting because he was a major player in Congress and Punjabi politics. Um, and one of the reasons why Punjab was in turmoil, because he was in political fights between himself and other Congress leaders in Punjab. There's a Darbara Singh, who was the chief minister of Punjab in the early 80s. So there was a real tussle between the two. So I think that the genesis of what was taking place in Punjab was actually from this political infighting. He was very pro Indira Gandhi. She made him president, when she came back to power in the early 80s. I think he was home minister first, then became president. So he was really a real lackey of the Congress party and the Gandhi family. But even him, he was not. He was in the dark when the Indian army was sent into the Golden Temple. He wasn't told, and there was a period just after June where he was thinking of resigning, but he didn't. The moral thing would have been for him to resign, and he didn't. And even November, when he knew that his own party was involved in mass killing, he still didn't. He still didn't resign. There was one famous journalist who told him that he'd seen Sikhs in morgues, stacked up in Delhi, and he just cried. So he was one of those people who completely, spineless, but also just wanted to stay in his kursi, his seat. Didn't want to lose his job, come what may. So it's a real sad story about him. What kind of person would do that? But there are Sikhs like that, particularly in Congress, who even afterwards protected the perpetrators. There's famous Sikhs in Congress who protected Bhagat Singh. Sorry, not Bhagat Singh. HKL Bhagat from the courts. And even today, you see Sikhs in Congress who refuse to believe that the Congress party was involved in the massacres. So Glenn, it's just not it's not black and white. There are people like that involved. But yes, absolutely, he was a sorry state at the end of it, and he did admit to his secretary before he died that he pointed the finger at the senior leaders in Delhi. So he named Sajjan Kumar, Jagdish Titler, Kamal Nath. He even said that on the night these people had met and talked about the slogan that they would use, Khun da Badla Khun. And he also said that they'd met the night after, on the night as well, with senior police leaders in Delhi. He knew full well that they were involved, but he at no stage actually said, I'm going to call these people out. So yeah, it's one of those awful stories of someone, a character who could have changed, who could have made a difference, but he refused to do that.
We've only got a few questions left, and obviously the most recent news regarding the events that took place in '84 is a lot to do with British involvement. And your chapters on this do a really good job of painting a very clear picture of what's happening. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but between 1975 and 1984, India spent something like £1.28 billion on British arms. Now, even today, that's a pretty big amount. So what does this have to do with what's happening during 1984, both in terms of June and November? And is it as clear cut as trade deals over lives, essentially, in terms of, well, first that, and then secondly, to what extent are the British actually involved?
So I think the recent revelations a few years ago, where it was clear cut that in terms of June '84, there were conversations, and there was a group of SAS that was dispatched to the Golden Temple to do survey and do some work for the army is documented. The actual reconnaissance report has suddenly gone missing. So I think there's a lot of stuff that's still hidden. And I think the government, the British government, is quite embarrassed of what taken place, particularly the Conservative government. It was Mrs. Thatcher was head of that government at the time, was very close to Indira Gandhi. She herself was, a victim of an assassination just 3 weeks before Mrs. Gandhi, the IRA and the bombing in Brighton. So she'd survived that attack. But yeah, she was very close to Indira Gandhi. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Trade deals and arms was top of the list of this, this country, as it is with, the likes of Saudi Arabia and, arms deals and, billions of trade trumps human rights. It has done for a long time. So, but, unfortunately, Sikhs were sort of sacrificed for those trade deals. And even years after, the government looked the other way. They took the official line that these was communal rights. They've never questioned the injustice of Sikhs. And yeah, it's one of those situations where it's very difficult for governments in the West to raise this issue to the government in India, where they want to be friends with. So yeah, I mean, I still think a lot will still come out in terms of what took place in '84 and the British government.
Well, in your book, you state that in 2016, a huge swathe of documents disappeared from the National Archives, were withdrawn by the FCO from the National Archives. And you've obviously previously just commented that the government must be embarrassed. Is there any idea of what those documents may include? Because obviously you spoke about this reconnaissance report, which I assume may or may not be one of these documents, but the fact no one can find it now is obviously very suspicious. But is there any idea of what these other documents could be, or is it essentially we have to wait and see if they ever kind of see the light of day?
I think we have to see, really. I think the big thing is the reconnaissance report that's mysteriously disappeared, and that would show what they did, these SAS people in the Golden Temple before the attack, what advice they'd given to the Indian government in terms of arms, logistics, helicopters, and so forth. Did they even suggest bringing in the tanks, which eventually happened? Did they pinpoint certain sacred sites? Did they look at the Sikh library, which was burnt after the attack? So there's various things that we do not know, and until we see that report, we can't really, presume what's in there. There may be other reports investigations that they may have carried out. We simply don't know. But what we do know that they did dispatch the SES, and what they've said to date is that they just advised the Indian government. They did not, they weren't part of the planning of the attack on the Golden Temple. It was more to do with advice than anything else.
So your book was obviously published in 2017, and it's obviously now been almost 5 years since, well, probably over 5 years actually. Has more come to light, or has there been something that, since you've published it, you've come across and has either added to the narrative or changed the narrative or in some way?
So that's really interesting because when it was published, and you probably know it wasn't just published here in the West, but also in India by an Indian publisher. And it was warmly received by lots of people. And I was quite struck and surprised that that had happened. So there is a body of people in India of all faiths who know what happened. They were there. Many of them did protect Sikhs. Many of them have been part of the campaign to get justice right across Sikhs, Indian society. So that's the first thing that I think it sort of brought home a lot of the memories that they had already had, but weren't actually put down on paper. So that I think is really important. since the publication, obviously, Sajjan Kumar has been convicted and he's in prison for life. So that happened about 2 years after my publication. Um, there have been few cases, but the bigger thing that, again, my book is trying to and did highlight is the whole narrative. We still have the issue of the narrative being the riot that's peddled not just by the officialdom, but also by the media, both in India and internationally. They can't see above the rights narrative. And I think that's something that I'm keen to, bring forth to people generally, that we really need to name the crime properly. This wasn't spontaneous. This was organized. This was targeted. This was premeditated. And the thing about genocide is you need to have intent. So the intent that I've outlined in my book, that there were meetings beforehand, there were mobs, there were leaders telling the mobs to destroy Sikhs as a group in whole or in part in those areas and to wipe them out. So there's definite intent there to wipe out Sikhs as a group. And that's the definition of genocide. So we really need to discuss what that meant in terms of naming the crime. Because if you don't name the crime, then how can you prosecute the crime? There's no use prosecuting people on communal riots. This is something very different. It has different elements. So you have the sexual violence and the genocidal rape element towards it. You had the targeting of Sikh gurdwaras and Sikh symbols as well. So there's definitely a religious element towards it. The the wiping out of communities and the ethnic cleansing of those areas. So there's lots of elements which are part of the genocide convention that you can identify. And then which I actually call for is, in India we do need a law against genocide. We don't have that at the moment. We need that on the statute book so we can actually start convicting people on the grounds of hate crime, calling for genocide, genocidal crime, and so forth. And I think that's been a real problem. When these cases come up, judges don't know what to call, what to convict people on, and they just say, oh, it was a communal thing and a few people died and that was it. Whereas actually behind that, there's the organization who brought the mobs together, who brought the weapons together, who covered up the violence afterwards, and then who carried on covering that up by using judicial judges to cover up the story. And the role of the media, the role of the police and the army, all that story has never been touched, even to this date. And I think it stems from that view of this being a communal right.
No, definitely. So your final chapter deals with truth, justice, and reconciliation, and you kind of have a general objective with this chapter in terms of what you're trying to achieve. Could you kind of explain to everyone listening what it is or what do you think should happen in terms of holding those who are responsible to account? So do you think that will, first of all, ever happen? And secondly, if it does, how do you think that should take place?
It's very difficult in India for that to happen. We have a situation, even to this day, where the Indian state do not recognize the full extent of the genocide that have taken place. So that's the real big issue. That framing of the violence was completely wrong, and then that sort of sidestepped the real truth about what took place. The Indian government and the states, rather than just apologizing, they really need to be accountable of what took place. And in terms of Congress, they need to open their books on this. They know a lot more than they say. So yeah, first of all, we need accountability. We need the powers to be the civil service, the judges, judiciary, police, army, all to put their hands up and say, this happened on our watch, and segments of our organizations were involved. So that's the first thing that needs to take place. It's no good calling for inquiries. That's already happened. We've had 2 inquiries which were whitewashes. And, I do call upon groups, Sikh groups, do not call for inquiries, because inquiries are government-led. They will, scope that inquiry, appoint the judge, and so forth. What we do need is an independent, victim-led, survivor-led truth and justice reconciliation commission. So this happened. We've got a good precedent on this. It's happened in South Africa, famously, where again, it was victim-led commission who could call the perpetrators, who could call victims to tell the truth. In some cases, the perpetrators were told, well, we won't convict you, just tell us the truth. And a lot of the truth did actually come out. But some of the crimes were so horrendous that people were convicted as well. So you can actually combine the two. Same thing happened in South America and also in Bosnia. So we really need to frame this so that the victims lead the justice and reconciliation, not the state, because the state was involved. So that's the first thing. So once you've done that, then you can start creating safe spaces for Sikhs to actually come out, the victims, the survivors, the women to have a safe space to talk about the rapes that had taken place. That's never been out. And there's 2 reasons for that. One, the state covered it up. So when, some of the doctors went in to take testimonies, the government doctors, they were all men, and they completely covered it up. And I think also, it's, you got to remember at the time there was a lot of stigma, and even now there's a lot of stigma against rape and sexual violence, even within the Sikh community. So there's a lot of people in the Sikh community that don't want this to come out because it's shameful, it's a stigma and so forth. So again, we need to create a space where women and girls can freely talk about this and then start getting help and counseling and so forth. So that's the first thing. And then we can start looking at the various other things that we can look at: genocide law, how we actually start convicting people, and so forth. So there's various things that we can do, that we've learned from South Africa and South America, that we can now, bring to India. But it will only happen when we have a government who's going to say, yes, this happened on, the government's watch in 1984. We're not just sorry. So back I think it was 10 years ago when Dr. Manmohan Singh apologized, and then that was it. Apology is nothing without accountability and justice. So we've got the apology, now we need accountability and then the justice, and that's what's missing.
So I've gotten through all of the questions that I had planned, but there's one question that has popped up in my head whilst we've been talking, and it's a personal question to some extent, because I remember I must have been 13 in 2004, so the 20-year anniversary, and I remember seeing there was like an exhibition, and when I mean an exhibition, it was just like some boards with some photos and some text on at the Gurdwara. And I remember seeing an image of a child who had essentially been half burnt to death, and it's still very viscerally imprinted into my memory. And even whilst we've been talking about this, it's quite a heavy subject, and I'm sure people listening to this are probably finding it similarly quite heavy. What was the personal impact on you when you're going through all of this research, you're visiting these areas, you're talking to survivors, and there's also obviously a personal connection, not just in terms of religion or connection to the country, but also your family is firsthand involved in this. What is the impact, and how have you been able to deal with that?
Initially, when it happened, it was a shock. and for years afterwards. And I think you probably um, get a sense from maybe your parents and grandparents that the shock um, materialized into a lot of emotion, particularly with that generation. So when you look at what happened afterwards, the marches, it was very emotional. It wasn't coordinated as much as it could have been. Obviously, there's a language issue at the time. So that was one thing. But I think with me, because I was based here rather than India, it was far easier for me to step back, look at the totality of what taking place. Even though when I went to India, it was quite emotional. I was involved in some of the human aspects, but the fact that I wasn't living there day to day kind of gave me an advantage to try and tell the truth um, in a more kind of independent and you know not completely divorced of the of what took place, but then I didn't allow it to overwhelm me completely, because I think if I'd lived there, I wouldn't have been able to do this. It would have been so overwhelming. I'd probably be too emotional. Whereas I think detachment helps. And also the fact that I've grown up in the West, in the shadow of the Holocaust, the shadow of Bosnia genocide, Srebrenica, which is for me a very good comparison. Srebrenica happened in 1992, the killing of 8,000 Muslim men and boys by the Serb forces. And that's a sort of a number I've sort of at least 8,000 Sikhs I think were killed in India, particularly northern India. So I think to kind of target that actually this was not comparable to the Holocaust, millions dead, but it was in the thousands. You could call it a small genocide, a genocidal massacre that had taken place. So I think me being detached and me also doing other things in my life, I'm very much into running, cycling. I'm a swimmer. I'm actually a swim teacher now, so I could kind of get out of not just 84 when I wanted to, because when it became too heavy, but also get out of the community, because up until you know point of my book being published, a lot of our community kept this story within the four walls of the Gurdwara. They never, very rarely, brought it out to the wider community in India and also in the West. It became very insular and inward looking when what we needed is to bring it out. So therefore, my involvement in my union, the National Union of Journalists. So I campaigned for a good 10 years up to my publication, you know, um, pushing motions in support of the victims in two of our conferences in the NUJ. My involvement also raising this in the Labour Party as well, and other human rights groups sort of helped me, I think. Whereas I think if I was in the community, I think it would have been too overwhelming.
No, definitely. Well, we've got to the end of all of the questions, including the ones that have just popped up along the way. So I obviously first have to say thank you for taking the time for doing this. I obviously just want to double check that we've gone over everything, or if there's anything you wanted to include. And if so, like obviously feel free to kind of let me know. But if not, then obviously I can only just say thank you for doing the book. I definitely think if people haven't read it, they certainly should do. It's a really comprehensive and very extensive story of what happened. It's very detailed, and I think it gives you all of the relevant information. And equally, it's not a heavy... Let me rephrase that. It's heavy in terms of the emotional impact, because it does get quite difficult. But in terms of actually to read through it, it's a very easy read in terms of its readability. So thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me, Owen.
So you've made it to the end of another podcast episode. I hope you learned a lot from this. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, as it means a lot more than you can imagine. If you wish to take your support even further, please consider becoming a YouTube member or joining our Patreon via the links in our description. Next month's podcast will be with BBC Antiques Roadshow arms and armour expert Ranjit Singh. Play the trailer.
So I knew you were going to ask me this question. So what I've done, I've taken an object from my current inventory, but actually trying to not be biased here, it is the most exciting and interesting object I've ever found. I'm going to take my ring off and my gudar as well. Controversial taking my gudar off. That's right, it's right here. I'm going to put a glove on. And my hand will reappear shortly.
You're not about to just break out into a Michael Jackson. No?
Yeah, I might have some white socks and black loafers on under there. Sequined socks, right? No. So here it is.
Oh, wow.
So this is a barganak.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.